Hey, I'm Lurpus. I played Counter-Strike for a living for 8 years. I've been on the desk for some of the biggest events for 5 years. I know nothing about Counter-Strike, but then again, neither does Thorin. Welcome to his YouTube channel.
Astana Dragons are a team that, unless you were following CSGO back in 2013, may have a confusing context to their history, because people might know they were the precursor to what in CSGO was Hellraisers. You think of Dosia, Angel, Adren, these players that you saw, Kucha, but not, by the way, the first ever Hellraisers. There was a Hellraisers in 1.6, which had Angel in it, which had Marklov, which actually had Jonta, who's the coach now of Hellraisers in CSGO. But whenever I hear people reference Astana Dragons, they seem to reference them in kind of a derisory manner, like they talk as though they were a shit team or just a failed team, or they didn't accomplish anything, or they were just like people thought they were going to be good and they didn't do anything. And that's actually not at all contextually accurate. This was a team that was one of the best teams in the world, that was beating some of the historically great teams, that was the hope of the CIS region to be the first truly great team from there, and maybe win a major or something along those lines when the majors came along. This was a team that had a lot of expectations, did deliver early on, but yes, in terms of the long-term goals of the project and the absolute top goals of winning a major, of being one of the best teams of all time, sure, they fell short of that. But it's important to understand the context of this team, because you have to realize we didn't ever have a team win a major from CIS until we got through to Gambit. We didn't have amazing teams until we got to Na'Vi later on. The team that was their own precursor in Astana Dragons, the Virtus.Pro lineup that was from the CIS, was a very good team, but actually didn't accomplish that much compared to Astana Dragons. So Astana Dragons was a top 4 team in the world in 2013. They were a team that beat NIP in 2 best-of-3 series offline. This is when NIP still very rarely lost offline series. At the time, mostly were still beating the very games of the world, beating most teams in best-of-3. They beat the pre-Pronax Fnatic, the team that won the major. When they added Pronax, they won the major. Before that, they had the same lineup of Flusher, Schneider, Devil Walk, JW, but their fifth at the time that we're talking about was Modi, now in Heroic. He was the in-game leader. They beat Na'Vi numerous occasions. Yes, this is 2013 Na'Vi. This is a team that transitioned from being the great 1.6 team to come over to CSGO to initially be pretty good, be top 3 themselves for a brief period of time. Then they had their players stolen when they were rebuilding, beaten by Astana Dragons numerous times. They had top 4 finishes at 3 big international tournaments that year. They had a top 8 finish at the first ever major. They were far from a scrub team. In fact, they were a team that, as I said, was very good and accomplished some pretty impressive stuff in the context of their day. So Astana Dragons was officially formed on July 17th when the team signed Angel and Dosia, so the Ukrainian and Russian players from Virtus.Pro. They signed Edward and Markelov from Natus Fincer, obviously stars of 1.6, and they signed Adren, formerly of Virtus.Pro, but he hadn't been in the most recent Virtus.Pro lineup because he'd been replaced by Guardian, the Slovakian player. So the concept here with this team was to build a CIS super team, and with the organization, they thought they had the money to do that. Organizations at the time, like Virtus.Pro and Na'Vi, weren't paying that much. CSGO hadn't blossomed it. We hadn't had the major circuit come around. So the concept here of making like a CIS super team, because you've got players from Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia, this was actually reminiscent of something that happened in the latter days of 1.6. A lot of people might know the story that the rich businessman who went under the gaming alias Arbalete pumped in money to the CIS scene, making tournaments and also international tournaments, and then he famously funded Na'Vi, right? Natus Vincer. That's how that team came to exist. He came to Starix, said, you're a veteran, pick the right players, pick players that just will win, don't do it about politics, here's like a salary, I'll sponsor everything for the first year. He ended up sponsoring it for the first 2 until he pulled out, and Na'Vi obviously that year, 2010, went on to be amazing. What a lot of people will forget, because it wasn't as memorable, is he also funded a second team called United, a team that had Adren in the team. It had Hooch. It had a bunch of really good players at the time. A guy called Romshka, who was a very good Russian player in 1.6. And that team was also, whereas Na'Vi was supposed to be all Ukrainians, amazing, go and do great things, United was explicitly supposed to represent the CIS region. So you look in different points in their history, they had Kazakhstani players, Ukrainian players, Russian players, and the problem they had was they weren't a very good team. They were a team that often went out in group stages. They had the odd decent upset result, some decent results sometimes at some of the Arbalete tournaments that were just the CIS ones, but they never did anything great. They never lived up to being a CIS super team. If anything, they were more like an exhibition team of like, here's what happens if you put some pretty good to good CIS players together, but without necessarily the same logic as like a national team that have all played together and they got the right mix. So Astana Dragons was much better than them. They got much closer to being a super team than that team did. Now, the key thing to understand is that one of the reasons why some people were underwhelmed by Astana Dragons is they weren't able to go much further than the legacy of the Virtus.Pro lineup they had replaced. That Virtus.Pro team, don't think of the Polish guys. Those guys at this point in time were playing for an organization, let me see, I think it was ESC at that point in time, and then later that year they joined Universal Soldiers, which is when they had the 5-man lineup that became Virtus.Pro the next year, I think, under the Virtus.Pro banner. So Virtus.Pro in 2013 was a very good team. This was the team where the first lineup was Dosia, who was one of the best players in the world, top 5 player in the world, amazing damage, spray, really strong rifles. Obviously, very slow player, but back then that was a very unique style of play actually in CS, where people playing very fast paced, so you actually end up being a pretty clutch player in some degrees. You had Adren, who at the time wasn't a superstar player, he was more like a supportive element in the team. You had Angel, pretty good fragging in-game leader, but very loose in-game leader style, more of the Russian style, the slow-paced stuff. You had, let me think, in the early days, who else was it? You had Fox, not the Portuguese one. It was the guy who's Dosia's brother, actually, a Russian player, who was a bit of an all-round player, kind of reminded me of sort of the Finnish Narsu, Lopez's brother. Funnily enough, he also looks similar to Narsu. Go look at some pictures. And then, let me think, who was the 5th player then? Was it Kucha in that team? I think it might have been, actually. Yeah, I think Kucha also might have been in that team. Former 1.6 player who is bizarre because he has dual citizenship, as far as I know, Ukrainian and Russian players. I saw his Russian flag in CSGO, and I was like, the fuck? Because in CS 1.6, I even played for the Ukrainian teams, and I thought he was Ukrainian, so I don't really know what's going on with that, but whatever. Obviously, close ties between Ukraine and Russia, especially over the last 100 years. So this team, Virtus.Pro, were very good in a sense, but what people will forget is this was an era dominated by NIP. They won most of the tournaments. Then after that, at the tournaments that Virtus.Pro wasn't at, that NIP wasn't at, Very Games would win a number of them, there weren't really many other teams winning tournaments. So as good as that Virtus.Pro team was, they were the team famously that stopped NIP's 87-0 streak. In Star Series, I think it was 5, they met NIP in the upper bracket final. They beat them 2-0 there. So they're 87-0 stopped there. Didn't become 88-0, 89-0. Then in the lower bracket, NIP made their way to the final. In the final, they played Virtus.Pro again. Virtus.Pro again beat them 2-0. So they 4-0'd the unbeatable NIP who'd never lost on LAN. Amazing fashion. Now, all the maps were very close. It was a mad fragging affair. It was a real brawl. The NIP players say there were some circumstantial reasons as to why they didn't play as well, but whatever. It was amazing. They went head-to-head with the best team we'd ever seen in CSGO, the unbeatable NIP, and they beat them in 4 straight maps of playing them. So the expectations were huge. Everyone thought, wow, we could have a proper rival to NIP. It's not like that Very Games team that's amazing going against everyone else, but loses against NIP. And, you know, all these other teams like Copenhagen Wolves, Western Wolves had come up, but they lost to NIP as well. So you thought, finally, a real rival for NIP. But you never got to see that lineup at a LAN again because they didn't go to ESEA. I think they might not have qualified or something. There was another LAN I think they skipped. And then they kicked Adren out of their team, despite the fact this team hadn't been to a LAN again. And they got in Guardian. Now, this seemed weird because, yes, Guardian, very skilled player from Slovakia, fabulous source player, but in CSGO, he'd just been playing for lesser teams. And obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, he doesn't speak Russian. He's not culturally Russian. And this is a squad communicating exclusively in Russian. And at that point in time, a number of those players, very poor English. So he had to come in that squad, and there was no option, let's switch to English. He had to learn Russian as he played for them. But luckily, he's a fabulous individual player and a very strong AWPer even back then in 2013. So with that Virtus.Pro lineup that had Guardian in, they still had some pretty big results. Again, they were able to take great teams close. In the semi-finals of DreamHack Summer that year, an event that NIP won, they took NIP close. I think it was a three-map series in the semi-finals there. They went to EMS1 Summer. Now, EMS1 obviously is the precursor to the ESL1 brand and was, at the time, ESL's biggest brand. We didn't have IEMs for CSGO at this point in time, and we didn't have majors. This was actually one of the biggest events that we had. Now, it was a smaller LAN. It wasn't as big a LAN as a DreamHack in terms of the pure number of teams, but it was set up. It was in like the ESL studios. It was on LAN. You had to qualify for it through an online season. It was a big thing. They were able to actually beat NIP in another offline series. They were the second team to win a best of 3 series. With their old lineup, they did it. With this lineup, they did it with Guardian. Guardian going ham in the semi-finals of EMS one summer. There was ones for spring, summer, fall. And in the final, they played against Very Games, but it was the Very Games that had Shocks. Shocks had joined at this point in time. And what makes this tournament notable is not just that the Virtus.Pro lineup was able to beat NIP, but after they beat NIP and went to the final, Very Games beat the Virtus.Pro lineup, and so Very Games got to win their first ever event with NIP in attendance. Now, they didn't beat NIP, but they won an event that NIP was at, and that was a big deal for them, and obviously that Shocks Very Games lineup went on to beat NIP for real, and later, for example, the next EMS one summer, and become the best team in the world. So it was a key kind of like transition point in their storyline. Now, Na'Vi, the other team that the players had been taken from, because obviously 3 of the players were in that Virtus.Pro lineup, Adren, Angel, and Dosia. You go over to Na'Vi. Na'Vi had come over from 1.6, but they'd come over very late. They'd played most of 2012 over back in 1.6, playing tournaments while the early CSGO tournaments were going on, because they were still top 3 teams, still winning money, still making finals. They came over late, and they brought their whole 1.6 lineup over, as many teams did. Fnatic, as the team Virtus.Pro, now the Polish teams at the time, ESC, did also. These teams thought, we'll just transition our whole team and we'll get good at CSGO. But all those lineups ended up learning that your team that you had in 1.6, not all those players are going to transition, and you're not all going to be good at CSGO, so they had to chop and change. So Na'Vi initially came in, they had their early issues, they got it together. There was a Star Series, I think it was Star Series 6, where, I know it's confusing because they've reset the numbers again, they were able to win a map on LAN against NIP and have a vaguely close final, but NIP still won. At that time, people thought, wow, this could be amazing. The killer for that team, though, unfortunately, was they went to a tournament called the Prague Challenge. I was actually at this tournament as a commentator doing it with Anders, the first time I ever met Anders in real life. And yes, she does, Anders, she does do it. And in the final of this tournament, they played a team called Nostalgi, which was a Russian mixed team. I say Russian because it was funded by a guy called Overdrive, who famously had money and could fund mixed teams that played with him in the lineup. But the players in this team was Taz and Neo. By the way, Neo not a god in CSGO, but okay, players from ESC. And it was Apex and Kenny S. So 2 players that were playing, I think, LDLC at the time. Kenny S, a very good player already. Apex not as well known. And Overdrive. So they have a Russian, 2 French players who barely speak any English at this point in time, 2 Polish players who could speak English, but it's not going to help them with a Russian, and 2 French players who don't speak English. So they had no shared language in this team. They just separated. Kenny S and Apex played together, Taz and Neo played together, and Overdrive tried not to die. When they lost the final to this team, it broke Na'Vi. And it wasn't long afterwards that this, I think it was like a week later, that the Astana Dragons lineup announced that they'd gotten Edward and Markov, the star players of Na'Vi from 1.6, some of the best players in the world for the last couple of years, to join this team. And that's why it was a super team. So the super team, about, I think, a month and a half after they'd formed, went to their first tournament, which was a tournament series that existed in Ukraine at the time. Was it Ukraine? I know it was in CIS series. I think it was in Ukraine. No, it might have. I think it was in a place called Almaty. I'm not on the correct. I don't know on that one. We'll see on that one. They went to a tournament series called Tech Labs, which in 2013 people would know. NIP had gone to it in the past. It was kind of in the vein of a Star Ladder type thing. At this tournament, I think they only played 1 match. It was like an exhibition one-off or something, and they played the pre-Pronax Fnatic that had Modi, and they beat them 2-1 in that final. A month later, well, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, they went to their first proper international tournament, which was DreamHack Bucharest. And this famously was the last big LAN that NIP won as number 1 team in the world, because after that, it was taken over by the Very Games team winning. At this tournament, Astana Dragons put up their first really good performance. They finished top 4. And in fact, when you look at the tournament, they could have gone further, because in their group stage, they beat Na'Vi, who they'd taken the star players from. Na'Vi, by the way, ended up going to the finals because Na'Vi got an easier side of the bracket. The problem was that after beating the N faculty team from Sweden in the round of 8, which was Pronax and Pitt and Carrigan, yes, there were some very weird lineups in 2013, by the way. Carrigan wasn't an in-game leader at that time. They went to the semi-finals and unfortunately had to play NIP there. Still won a map against NIP, still made it a close series, but lost the series. NIP went to the finals, NIP won the event. Now, why is it unfair? Because NIP actually came second in their group, and that's actually one of the reasons they ended up on this side of the bracket. And in fact, they'd also screwed out Very Games, who came first in their group and played NIP in the first round, back when Very Games always used to lose to NIP on LAN. So actually, Astana Dragons, who knows, they might have been the second best team in this tournament, might have been the third best, whatever. Top 4, still a good result overall. Winning a map against NIP, good sign for a team that obviously had a core that had won maps against NIP before all the players in the team had at that point, which was a very rare piece of trivia accomplishment to have, even at that point in time, a year into CSGO being out. Then, online, they had some initial problems where they didn't qualify for EMS 1 Fall, the next season of the EMS, where they'd been second when they'd been the Virtus.Pro players, because they lost to the Mouse Sports team online at the time, because the Mouse Sports was mad onliners at that time. The next big tournament was a Star Series tournament, so it was in CIS again. It was Star Series 7. Remember, 6 had been the one that Na'Vi had come second at, 5 had been the one where Virtus.Pro had beaten and dethroned NIP. At this tournament, they beat Fnatic. They lost to Very Games, but won a map against them in the upper final. Remember, Very Games won this event and went on to be the best team in the world from now on, and including beating NIP. In the lower bracket, Astana Dragons got to face NIP again, another 3-map series. This time they got revenge. They beat NIP. So the core of this team has now beaten NIP in 3 offline best-of-3 series in 2013, when NIP is still the number 1 team, one of the best teams ever, looks unbeatable against most teams. In the final, Astana played against Very Games, the Shocks lineup, the Scream lineup, MBK, Smith's, Existence. They lost 0-2. They didn't win a map this time, but they came second place. So improvement, big international tournament, you've outplaced NIP. That's no fucking joke. Very few teams ever did that. Then came the next tournament. It was a few weeks later, and it was ESWC, one of the big tournaments we had internationally at that point in time. In the group stage, they actually got revenge. Someone got revenge against them. Fnatic. There we go. They managed to beat Copenhagen Wolves in the quarterfinals. Copenhagen Wolves, by the way, was the core that later on went to be Dignitas, TSM, Astralis. So it had Dupree, etc. in the lab. I think at that point in time, they might not have had Device, though. I think they actually had Pimp and Freeze at that point in time, and Fetish and Zipnix. In the semi-finals, so they're already guaranteed another top 4 finish, they shockingly lost. We actually all thought in this semi-final that Astana Dragons was going to the final and that they were going to be playing against NIP or Very Games, depending on who came out the other side of the bracket. Actually, what happened is in the semi-final, when you hear this name, you're going to know why they didn't make the final. They played against Clan Mystic of Apex and Kiyashima. And this was a team that at the time, Hearts from 1.6, a team at the time no one expected anything from. They were not supposed to do anything. They never did anything after this event. But at this one event, they were magical and they won the LAN. They even beat Very Games in the final and won the fucking event. So massive shock for everyone. They still managed to get a map against Clan Mystic, this bizarre team. And then ESWC was one of those tournaments that had a single LM bracket but did a third place decider game. Anyone who's watched the World Cup will know those still exist, but they're kind of fucking pointless. But this third place decider game was Astana Dragons against NIP, because on the other side of the bracket, NIP had lost online again to Very Games of Shocks. So NIP versus Astana Dragons, chance for another match. And you know what? Astana Dragons won another best of 3 online against NIP, this time 2-0. They didn't even lose a map. Now, admittedly, third place decider, and ESWC was famous for wonky third place deciders, where the team that was actually the better team often just didn't give a fuck and just gave up the match and lost in an upset. Now, interestingly enough, despite finishing third, despite beating NIP, because they lost to Clan Mystic, and because they hadn't yet won a big LAN in terms of these international tournaments, they'd lost to Very Games, they lost to NIP, they'd beaten NIP, but they'd lost to NIP at DreamHack Bucharest. Because the team had such high expectations, they made a roster move. Edward actually wasn't playing very well at that point in time. I know people are going to joke like, haha, still isn't. Did he ever? Well, actually, Edward in some of the later years in Na'Vi was a pretty good player at times. Not a star player. I mean, he was a star player when he first came back, but a solid support player. At this point in time, though, he was having a lot of problems transitioning from being a star player in 1.6 and in the Na'Vi lineup of the early CSGO days. So he was removed, and in came former Virtus.Pro player Kucha, obviously teammate of Angels in the past. He joins the lineup, just kind of a fragger, can also secondary AWP if you need. They went to, again, their first tournament with the new lineup was also Tech Labs. This was the Tech Lab Cup final, Tech Labs Cup final. And in this tournament, they played against the best of the CIS region. You had Na'Vi, who had Edward back, I think, at this point in time, actually. You had a team called 3D Max. You had Universal Soldiers, who was the lineup that you knew until very recently as Virtus.Pro. They lost to Na'Vi, shockingly, in the first match in 3 maps. Beat 3D Max, got revenge on Na'Vi in 3 maps. In the final, beat the team that later was known as Virtus.Pro with the same lineup. 2-1, won the tournament. So, okay, it wasn't NIP, it wasn't very games, but it showed that the level of this team, despite even a loss, was still very good. It was obviously a tournament where you played full best of threes, it wasn't best of ones. Then we came to the fateful first major in CSGO, DreamHack Winter 2013. It was the end of November, leading into early December. Now, what happened was a very bizarre group stage happened for this team. Because in their group stage, they had a team called Reason, which was a guy called Colon, who was famously considered a cheater. Some people thought the under 1.6, but seemed to have talent. You had MSL, who at this point in time was a supportive player, wasn't in-game leader yet, I think. You had Copenhagen Wolves, who obviously were the team I just said. Pimp, Freeze, Fetish, Dupree, Zipnix. And you had SK Gaming, who was a Swedish lineup at the time. It was Peter, now the coach of NIP. It was Twist, obviously later LGB player in Godsent most recently. You had Delpan, one of the best players in 1.6 in terms of AWP. You had Modi, who'd been kicked out of Fnatic. And you had a player called Zelos, who people might remember was actually temporarily banned for cheating from an ESL club in the early days of CSGO because he beat fucking NIP in a game or something. Everyone thought he cheated. The story's too fucking long. So anyway, these were the teams they had in their group. So that group's very easy. This team, Astana Dragons, remember, they're ranked 2 or 3 in the world. So they absolutely should be getting out of the group. I mean, they're ranked 3rd in the world, realistically. They should be absolutely getting out of this group. Bizarrely, when they played Copenhagen Wolves, they played them on Nuke. Not actually a map that you'd expect to play them on, because Copenhagen Wolves famously was always decent on Nuke. They lost it in a very weird fashion, but still got out of the group, but got out of the group in 2nd place. Now, the reason why that's weird is because on the other side of the bracket, in the other groups rather, I think people already knew that number 1 from this group plays number 2 from the other group. Now, at the time when they lost this game, if my memory isn't incorrect, I haven't looked it up, this is going from memory, they lost this bizarre game where they were actually favourites and came 2nd out of their group, which meant that they would play Complexity from another group, because Complexity had scored a massive upset on Inferno, the famous Brax, fake with the bomb to go to A instead of B, after they fully hit B as it was a proper attack. They'd beaten VeXii, the number 1 team in the world, the favourite for the tournament. And so, since the Astana Dragons teams had lost to VeXii every time they played them in a big match, they accidentally lost the game and didn't have to play them in the bracket stage. And in fact, we're on the other side of the bracket. Convenient how these things work out, isn't it? But you know what? Didn't end up working out for this team, because you know what they found out? Complexity was no joke. They played Complexity. They were favoured to win. Complexity didn't have that much mad firepower. Complexity, by the way, was Sean Gares, Semphis, Hiko, Nothing, and Swag. So, not a bad lineup, but wasn't mad skilled lineup. It wasn't the level of the Europeans. They'd never had a placing comparable to the Europeans. They were a team that could maybe make playoffs and come top 8 sometimes, but wasn't winning any tournaments. In this matchup, though, Sean Gares did a great job reading the guys from Astana Dragons. He'd really done his homework with the demos, and they were able to edge out a close 3-map series, and including only losing on Nuke to Astana Dragons. So Astana Dragons, if anything, showed, we actually are really good on Nuke. I wonder what the fuck was going on in that group stage game, because Nuke was one of their better maps. So Complexity managed the big upset over the number 3 ranked team in the world, and that's how Complexity and Fnatic ended up on the other side of the bracket, while it was NIP and VeXii on the second side. It should have been Astana Dragons, Fnatic there, and potentially Astana Dragons in the final. So that was a big fuck-up. That performance there was underwhelming, and they did definitely mess up their tournament run. That should have been something where, if anything, we should have been saying, but if VeXii had been on your side of the bracket, won that match, would have been very different, So actually, they tried to game the system a bit, didn't quite work out for them. The last tournament of the year was a tournament called Star Series Season 8, still Star Series back in CIS, and this was one that was incredibly bad for this squad, because obviously you don't have VeXii there, you don't have NIP there. They lost in the first match, or was it a different match? I think it was the first game. They lost to a team called Game Pub, and this is at the end of 2013, right? Think how young Nico is now. Nico was in that team with a bunch of Serbians as some young-ass kid. People had barely heard of him. In fact, he was even aliased, I think, as Nicolinho, so obviously a bit like that Brazilian name of Little One or whatever. And they got 2-0'd by Game Pub. Then, in the lower bracket, they lost to Na'Vi, who it might have just been at this time that Na'Vi added Edward. I can't quite remember. But anyway, they lost to Na'Vi in 3 maps. So this was Edward's revenge. And they went out in 4th place at a 4-team tournament. That was CIS teams, where they're supposed to be the CIS super team. So you know what? On December 30th, Astana Dragons cut this team, or they lost the team. People say there was financial problems there. They couldn't maintain all the things they promised in the project. And you know what? Fair enough. Because in this squad, those here had been a bit underwhelming. Hadn't been the superstar player he'd been earlier in the year in Virtus.Pro. Markelov had done pretty well, actually. He'd improved from his Na'Vi form. I mean, actually, at the Tech Lab Cup that I was talking about before, where they played Universal Soldiers, he went fucking super hammer, like a 30 plus 37 in the series or something mad like that. Edward had done pretty well up to a point till he got cut because of those not winning the tournament, basically, not even bad results. Angel had kind of poor form at this point in time. He was a bit lost as an in-game leader. As an individual player, he was just okay. And Adren actually did decently enough when he was in the lineup. Like, he kind of showed that he had some of the skills that later would develop into being a really good player, but he hadn't been able to show in Virtus.Pro because he'd be more of a supportive element. Now, one of the problems this team had was their map pool. Because, first of all, they didn't have many maps that they could win definitely. Now, because they were so skilled individually, they could go back and forth on many different maps, but they only had a few maps that they were actually beasts on. So on Mirage, yeah, they were a pretty strong team. They beat a bunch of teams, Fnatic, Very Games, and IP. They were no joke on that map. Took them over to Nuke. They were also very good. Surprising, actually, because CIS teams weren't famous for being good on Nuke in 1.6 or CSGO early on, although the Virtus.Pro lineup was good on that map. They also were able to beat Fnatic, Complexity, Clan Mystic, Universal Soldiers. So again, they were a pretty solid team on this map. Cash, they didn't play very much and they were alright on. Train, they stayed away from. Inferno was where the problems started. Inferno and Dust 2 were where this team's flaws were that prevented them from being a truly great team, winning massive tournaments, potentially winning a major. Because they would play Inferno the most of all the maps. They actually seemed to like it and have no problem with it. A lot of people were willing to play Inferno just as they are today, because it's got a lot of play in it, a map. You can use a lot of styles. This was a massively problematic map. They lost so many games to teams that were so much worse than them, and regularly to good teams, without many big wins over the top teams on this map. And this is a map that everyone played. So that was the beginning of their downfall. The other one was, with such a skilled lineup, playing a slow style, you'd think Dust 2 would suit them. Actually, it didn't really. This could be a problem. They lost tons of games on this map. They didn't win many compared to how many they played. And it was one of the more played maps that they had. So you can start to see where their problems came in the map pool. Now, ultimately, yes, this team did fail at their largest goal. They didn't have the success they desired. That kind of the team was constructed to have. You heard they had a whole bunch of top fours, finishes. They were beating NIP in series. Basically, only Very Games was like unbeatable for them. They had a couple of times they could have gone to other finals, maybe DreamHack Bucharest, maybe ESWC, maybe the first major. They did all these great things. And at the time, they represented something very special because Virtus.Pro had been good, but only showed us a little bit. This was a team that was a legit chance to win a major in CSGO for the CIS region. At the time, that doesn't sound like much now because you know Navi's been great and you know Gambit did it. But at the time, that was a big deal because after this team became Hellraisers afterwards, because that's what happened, the squad went and just became Hellraisers, which I think reverted back and there's something going on with the company there and a bunch of them stayed in the team. They were never as good again. They were never an elite team. They never won big tournaments, basically, at the international level. They were kind of a team that wasted away over time. So once the Astana Dragons name died, the best chance for another team from CIS to win a major wasn't until late 2015 when along came Na'Vi with Guardian in its lineup. They had Flamey finally, and they were able to make that miracle run to the final of DreamHack Cluj-Napoca. It wasn't until then, years later, that we had a CIS team that could have won a major. Now, Virtus.Pro potentially could have won a major if we'd have had them in the early days of CSGO. If we'd have had them from 2012 to early 2013, around spring 2013 is when they beat NIP, when they would have been the team that was in position, or if they'd been one in the summer when they'd had Guardian, sure, they would have been a 2 or 3, not top 2 or top 3 favourite to win that major. But there weren't any. Now, as I said, there was issues with finances. Maybe they weren't given everything they were promised. Maybe they promised more money and more time for the project than they actually did. But for whatever reasons, it didn't happen. So the team fell apart, lost the name, became Hellraisers, same squad, and became infamous for upsetting better teams, really good teams, and then losing to lesser teams. The most famous example being EMS1 Katowice, where they were able to put Very Games out of the tournament, number 1 team in the world, Titan actually at the time, and then just went and got absolutely banged out by the Dignitas team of Device and Dupree and those guys instantly in the round of 8 in mega fashion. Now, one of the problems with this squad is that in their goal of putting together all these players to make a super team, they really disrupted the CIS scene. Na'Vi didn't become good again until they got Guardian the next year, and he started to really start hard carrying. And even then, they weren't an elite team at the level of Virtus.Pro. They were just a good team, top 10 team, sometimes a little bit higher, had some good upsets. Hellraisers, the team they became after Astana Dragons, basically just chilled. It was almost like a retirement home, it felt like, for old veterans who were just gradually whiling away and wasting away, going down the results, down the placings, getting less and less threatening, less and less good maps. And in fact, one of my first videos on this channel was about how Hellraisers was like an absolute waste of time by the end. And that was in like the latter part. It would have been like autumn 2014. I made that video like almost a year after the Astana Dragons time. They then, obviously, Hellraisers only really became a really good team again. Not really good, became a good team again when they became kind of transitioned to the non-CIS squad, getting all the people who are from Czech Republic, Oscar, Slovakia, Stiko, Zero, when they got these players in and it became more Bondik and fucking, what's his name? Angel. That was the only person left over was Angel. That's when they became a good team again. So that's how long it even took that org to recover. Then you look elsewhere, you didn't have a flip side yet because that team hadn't come around until 2014. Then came Blade. Obviously, there was no Gambit because Gambit actually picked up some of the players that were in the Hellraisers team that had wiled away a lot and then actually revitalised things and put in more ex-Hellraisers players and eventually obviously became a very good team thanks to Adren and so on. So Astana Dragons were not the joke that people make out. They certainly weren't a team that like did nothing and accomplished nothing. They didn't accomplish their ultimate goals. Very few teams ever do. But they were a fabulously ambitious project. There were moments they had of brilliance. They were able to accomplish great things. Map pool wasn't quite as good as it should have been. They played a fairly simplistic style, but they actually could have done some things a bit better, and they were, at the time, for the first few years, a great team. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Daniel Yordanov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, and Travis Greb, with a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Want teasers for my upcoming content? To ask a question for my monthly AMA? How about taking part in a discussion with me about esports? Or perhaps you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Become a part of the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.